I want you to answer my fucking question.
What's up and welcome back to Truth Over Tea. In today's video, we're going to review my recent call into The Line to debate Matt Dillahunty. We'll be debating the topic of does God exist? And let's just say the conversation ends with a rage quit. Shall we take a gander?
Which God are you going to prove?
Well, I am a Christian.
Okay, never mind. I was going to say before you answer, I want to write down what I think you're going to, the direction you're going to go, but it's already spoiled now that you said you're Christian. Go ahead.
Okay.
Okay.
What evidence do you have that you think should convince us that some version of the Christian God exists?
Right. So I kind of start from, is theism or naturalism more likely to be true? Because to me,
it's already a big problem.
Okay. Can I ask why?
Yeah, because that's a question that is not a proper dichotomy. Theism
it's not a dichotomy.
Yes. So when you ask a question, is theism or naturalism more likely to be true? You already poisoned the well with a false dichotomy, but that's not evidence.
Well, so let me get my thought out here and then feel free to critique. So I acknowledge that there are other views, but from what I remember, both of you are naturalists. And just like most of the discussions I've had, philosophers I've read.
No,
you're not?
No.
I'm sorry.
But you don't understand this. For 20 fucking years, I've been saying I am not a philosophical naturalist. I'm a methodological naturalist. I have no idea whether or not anything supernatural exists, and I don't think anybody else does either, and I don't know how anyone would ever demonstrate that anything supernatural exists or that it can interact with reality in any detectable way. But I am not a philosophical naturalist, because philosophical naturalism asserts that the natural world is in fact all that exists, and I don't know.
This is something I hear atheists say a lot. While atheism affirms the proposition that there is no God, philosophical naturalism, also known as metaphysical naturalism, is the view, as Matt described, that nothing exists beyond the natural world. It's true that one can be a non-naturalist atheist, as many atheists adopt this position, but a lot do it to sidestep the burden of proof for certain implications of an atheistic worldview. However, Matt rejects anything supernatural and has argued against the existence of metaphysical truths. Okay. Well, my apologies then. I guess what I was trying to start with was I kind of weighed that, because to me, those are the two most likely. Maybe you could weigh in deism, but for this specific argument, this would kind of lump in the potential between deism and theism, and then from there you would determine whether deism or theism is more likely to be true. I think like at the very top level, without like getting down into more specific worldviews, those are like at the very top level, naturalism or some form of no God as opposed to theism, and then deism.
So we just spent all this time with you saying the most likely options are that there is a God or there isn't a God. Those are the only options, not just the most likely ones.
Right, but I want to make sure I'm.
But if there are only two options, if there are only two options, either there is a God or there's not a God, then you don't need to say that those are the two most likely. Those are the two only possibilities, and you're trying to demonstrate that one of them is correct. And you said you had convincing evidence for it. So what is it?
Sure. So I think that the Kalam is a good argument, but I think that the traditional ways that it's been defended actually fail. I think William Lane Craig himself, the biggest proponent of the Kalam, actually doesn't defend it in the way that he should. He uses arguments that I think, like Grim Reaper type defenses, that I think have problems. And so I have a defense of the Kalam. Yeah.
What's the conclusion of the Kalam cosmological argument?
The universe has a cause.
Yeah. Does the Kalam cosmological argument include the word God at all?
No, but this would be a starting point.
So it's not only not evidence, it's not even an argument for the existence of God. It is an argument for the universe having a cause, which means in order to get to a God, you need to then come up with evidence that adds in what that kind of cause can be. I think the Kalam is horribly flawed, as I've done multiple videos and debates. I think the first premise is problematic, and so is the second one. But for the sake of today, let's just, only for the sake of argument, grant you that the universe has a cause. How do you demonstrate that that cause is God?
So I think it's best to look at what our options are at this point. You know, obviously, we can't really use the scientific method to determine
Why not?
beyond the universe. Beyond the universe? I mean, we could, but
why do you think there is anything beyond the universe at all? I'm not aware that that's even a possibility.
So if the universe began to exist,
That's
right,
not
that's a
the
change
case.
from a state of non-existence to exist.
That's
So
not the
then
case.
you went from denying the Kalam,
assertion,
or
I reject the premise that the universe began to exist. You haven't demonstrated that the
Okay.
universe or the things in the universe didn't always exist in some form or another.
okay, I thought you were granting the Kalam, so my apologies.
So
I'm
would you rather
granting,
me?
I'm granting for the sake of argument that the universe has a cause. I reject the Kalam on both premises.
At this point, it's getting hard to have a productive conversation. His inconsistency in granting and then denying the Kalam makes it difficult. Matt also claimed to accept the conclusion for the sake of the argument, but denies the premises. Accepting the conclusion means you must grant the premises. Accepting that the universe has a cause implies that it began to exist. For anyone who isn't familiar with the Kalam, the argument goes as follows, as famously formulated by William Lane Craig. Premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore, the universe has a cause. Let's keep watching. Okay, so I guess, should we move to try to defend the Kalam, or should we move as if we've accepted the Kalam, and then why the cause? I think the best explanation is theism.
Well, wow, I don't know why this is so difficult. I'm giving away the farm and saying I will go ahead and concede for the sake of this argument that the universe has a cause. What is your convincing evidence that that cause is God?
Okay, so what I was saying before was that if the universe began to exist, right, from a cause, this would mean that something that must be beyond the universe, or at least outside of our physical universe, whether it's a universe immaterial generating machine of some sort, or a theistic God, or perhaps a series of universes creating new universes somehow over and over
How
again.
do you tell which one of those is true?
So we can try to find, like, what's the best explanation from either a Bayes perspective?
No, you can't.
Nope.
So first of all, I'm not going to accept abductive arguments, but also you don't have enough information to determine what are the possible explanations and which are most likely, because we have no ability to investigate beyond our universe.
Rejecting abductive arguments is essentially rejecting inference to the best explanation. I'm not sure he truly wants to do that. I don't think he really wants to take that position. Doing so would mean dismissing the Big Bang Theory. Since we rely on abductive reasoning to support it, we can't run experiments to trigger the expansion of a new universe. He would have to also reject abiogenesis, or any modern synthesis or other form of Darwinian evolution. In fact, he'd be forced to abandon any belief that depends on explanatory inference drawn from observation, including many of his own beliefs. However, we are able to use philosophical analysis to determine the most probable and plausible explanation based on evidence available. Unless, of course, he's also prepared to discard both deductive and inductive reasoning. I'm not sure if he caught my mention of Bayes' theorem, but I would hope he wouldn't dismiss such a widely accepted mathematical tool for assessing conditional probability. Philosophers frequently use it to support various arguments, And in this case, it provides a useful framework for evaluating the conditional probability of a universe having a cause under theism versus atheism.
How do you determine that God is more probable than a universe generating pixie?
So we could use, well, first let me ask you, what do you mean by universe generating pixie? Can you elaborate on that?
You listed several possible things for what might explain the origin of the universe in its present state, whether it's a multiverse, a series of universes, a God, a universe, and I added in a universe generating pixie. You have several candidate explanations there, none of which have been demonstrated to actually be candidate explanations. You're just assuming that you should be able to include those as candidates, even though there's no demonstration that they are in fact even possible. There may be, even if one of them has to be correct, there's no demonstration that any individual one of them is possible at all. And so you don't even know that you have candidate explanations. But my question was, how do you tell which of those candidate explanations is more probable when you can't demonstrate that any individual one is possible and you have no way to investigate them?
So from a possibility perspective, I mean, so long as there's not a logical contradiction, I think it's at least plausible to investigate it. And finally, the reason I asked him to clarify what he meant by a universe generating pixie is to understand the specific attributes he's assigning to it. For the concept to be logically coherent, he would need to attribute to the pixie the same essential characteristics that theists ascribe to God. Atheists often use this tactic to parody the theistic argument for a first cause, whether it's a unicorn, a pixie, or a flying spaghetti monster. But in doing so, they are essentially presenting the same argument as theism, just under a different label. This approach does not undermine the case for theism. Like, there's no sense in investigating a contradiction.
Adam, I apologize. This is I'm going to use the word dishonest, but I don't think that you're intentionally being dishonest. This is the dishonest aspect about apologetics. Because what you just described is we have no way to demonstrate whether or not it is in fact possible, but you find it plausible. I don't, and I don't care, and I don't care who finds it plausible. I care what is demonstrably possible and what is probable in order to determine what is most likely. You don't get to just say, I find it plausible, therefore I get to include it, and therefore I can determine that it's more probable than some other explanation. There needs to be demonstrations.
If I wanted to play that game, I would just be hypothetically the proponent of simulation theory, which you would have been incapable of defeating with your magic theory.
Now, I actually believe Matt would have agreed with me had he listened fully. We have a limited range of potential explanations for what could cause a universe to begin. A good starting point for any hypothesis is to carefully define it and ensure it's free of contradictions. Now, as Jimmy mentioned, simulation theory is quite compatible with theism, and in fact, many theists argue in favor of it. On the other hand, it is much less compatible with atheism. I have justifications for my belief. Now, there's also utility in this belief, like from a pragmatic sense.
You don't, though, have justifications. When I asked you, you called in to say
you haven't even let me make my argument.
Okay, you can start whining about that now, but in reality, you called in to say you had convincing evidence. And every time I've asked you about this, not only have you not presented evidence, you have gone down a road where you are going to consider candidate explanations where there's no demonstration of even possibility, but you find them plausible. Do you not see why that's a problem?
I haven't seen, I haven't really been able to flesh out my point to begin with.
I'm sorry. I don't even think a specific question right there. The reason you haven't been able to flesh out your thing is because you started with bad arguments and flawed reasoning from the beginning, and it's my job.
What's my bad arguments and flawed reasoning?
I already pointed that out. It's my job to make that clear so that we don't spend 10 minutes of you going down a path that is flawed from the beginning. And the flawed from the beginning is that the Kalam says nothing about God. You have to add to it for that. So we went ahead and skipped and granted you all of that. And then it is, how do you tell what the potential candidate explanations for the change in state of the universe is, and you listed some without demonstrating that they're possible. And when called out that they hadn't had any demonstration of even possibility, you went to it's plausible, which is just saying you find it compelling, which is irrelevant. And I asked you just a minute ago, do you not see the problem with that? And instead of answering me, you went on to say something else. Do you not see a problem with asserting that your assessment that it's plausible is sufficient to ignore the fact that there's been no demonstration even of possibility?
Matt is asking me a loaded question here. He's asking me if I agree with an argument I didn't make. I've seen him pull this before, and I was prepared for this. And you'll see he's getting agitated with me for pointing out that he's misrepresenting what I said and ignoring his loaded question. So what I actually did was I established a criteria to start with.
Sorry, I asked you a specific question and then came back and asked you the same question again, and you are now trying to tell me what you said instead of answering the question. Do you not?
Because you're misrepresenting what I said.
Do you not see that there is a problem with asserting that something is a viable candidate explanation because you personally find it plausible, despite the fact that there is no demonstration that it is even in fact possible? Do you not see a problem there?
So you're leaving out purposefully the criteria that I also
I'm going to mute you,
purposely.
Which was,
wait, I thought we were upset with assigning motivations. Wasn't that?
And now that I've called him out for intentionally leaving out aspects of my initial argument, he's getting more agitated. To determine whether a candidate explanation is possible, one must investigate it. Matt also claims that plausible is defined as an assertion you are convinced of. No, that is false. Plausible is defined as something that is reasonable or probable. Definitions matter.
I want you to answer my fucking question. When we list candidate explanations, we don't get to include candidate explanations without a good reason. We should not be able to include candidate explanations without a demonstration that they are possible, which is why I asked you if you could demonstrate that it was even possible. And your response was to say it was plausible, which is basically an assertion that you are convinced of it, but that is not a demonstrated possibility. So I'll ask you this question again in a slightly different way. If somebody offers you candidate explanations that you have no reason to believe are even possible, how do you respond? And now I will unmute you.
Okay, if I have no reason to believe that they're possible, is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay, if I have no reason to believe that they're possible, like they're logically contradictory, then I wouldn't take what they have to say seriously.
Adam, that is not at all a correct understanding of what I said, and I'm going to explain it real quick. I didn't say if you believe they are impossible, and you gave a reason why you might think something is impossible because it's logically contradictory. I said if you don't have reason to believe it is possible. That is completely different from whether or not you have a reason to believe it's impossible. So if they make a candidate explanation that you have no reason to believe is possible, and they offer you no demonstration that it is possible, how do you respond to that?
I mean, it depends on what we're talking about, but I would probably be very skeptical.
It shouldn't. It shouldn't depend on what you're talking about. That's the point. That's what logic is. Logic is content agnostic. And so if somebody says, I'm going to give you a candidate explanation that we have not demonstrated is possible, and I will not show is possible, how do you deal with that?
Well, I just answered that I would be skeptical.
I don't think you know what skeptical means, but okay.
I, for example,
be
when
cautious.
you did that, I was skeptical, and that's why I threw it out.
When somebody tells me they have a candidate explanation that they cannot demonstrate is even possible, that candidate explanation is no longer a candidate. It does not get to be considered as a candidate explanation until it has been demonstrated to be possible, plausible, and truly a candidate explanation for the phenomenon we're trying to explain. Otherwise, I would have to take every untestable, unfalsifiable, I don't know if it's possible or not, Maybe I farted a universe out. Is that possible? I don't know, but you didn't show it was impossible, so we get to conclude that as a candidate. This is why we need to demonstrate how and why something should be considered a candidate explanation. That's the only point I was trying to make. Hopefully that's clear.
That is exactly what I was attempting to do.
You're so full of shit. You're so full of shit. If you actually were attempting to do that, you would have answered the question when I first asked, instead of saying you find it plausible.
So before I said I find it plausible, I said the first metric of criteria is that it can't be a contradiction. I don't understand why you argue with that. Do you not agree?
Okay, because, Captain not fucking listening, whether or not it is logically contradictory is irrelevant to the question. If something is logically contradictory, that would definitely mean it's impossible. But there are other things that are not fucking possible, even though they're not logically contradictory, they are empirically contradictory. It is not possible for me to flap my wings and fly based on all of the information that I have. And so if somebody says, hey, is it possible for Matt to flap my wings and fly? You can't say that's logically contradictory, because it's not. There are other ways in which we evaluate whether or not something is possible. And yet every time I try to get you to understand the distinction between I am not convinced that X is possible and I am convinced that X is impossible, you only, every single time, go to logical contradiction. That is not enough. That is not the only thing that determines whether or not something is possible.
I agree.
Try again.
I agree. I was just starting there. That's literally, I started there and then you cut me off.
Okay, Adam, you know what I'm going to do now? Hey, Jimmy.
Hello.
What's up?
I cut him off.
I just enjoyed
he just rage quit and kicked me. And there she blows. Matt totally rage quit in the end. Throughout the conversation, I was trying to present the reason for why I believe theism offers the best explanation for the origin of the universe. My goal was to apply Bayes' theorem to compare the conditional probabilities of theism and atheism as potential causes. Although there are other avenues of which I could have explored, this I feel is the quickest. In this framework, Matt made it clear he doesn't believe it's possible for anything to exist beyond our universe. As a result, his position requires accepting the universe's origin as a brute fact, something that exists without explanation, or something that is, such as the cause in this instance, without explanation. If we begin from a neutral stance, assigning equal prior probabilities, 50-50, to both theism and atheism, we can then assess whether either hypothesis gains plausibility through explanatory power. By definition, a brute fact cannot offer explanatory virtues. It simply is. In contrast, theism allows for logical, meaningful explanations that can increase its probability. For example, if God is good by nature, he would have a reason to create more good. A universe that permits the existence of moral agents capable of doing good would align with that nature. This is just one way to increase the prior probability of theism as the more plausible case. Unfortunately, I was never able to fully articulate this line of reasoning. Matt repeatedly interrupted and diverted the discussion, effectively gaslighting me at times. He seemed uninterested in the evidence or arguments and appeared determined to reject theism outright. Sadly, this isn't uncommon among certain atheist activists, who often apply an extremely high standard of evidence to theism while holding their own views to a much lower bar. For most of the conversation, it felt like he was just trying to back me into a corner with a barrage of loaded questions, all while doing acrobatics to avoid getting boxed in himself. It started to look less like a debate and more like dodgeball with logic. I'd say this was a textbook case of intellectual dishonesty. But hey, maybe he was just having a rough day, Or maybe he was recovering from a bad cold or a bad argument. Who knows? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if there's a skeptic, atheist, or interdimensional spaghetti monster apologist with a platform you'd like to see me chat with next, drop their name below. Hit like, smash that subscribe button, and I'll catch you next time.